The Roman gladiatorial system represented one of history's most complex and morally troubling entertainment industries, built upon a sophisticated network of human trafficking, investment, and exploitation. While popular culture often romanticizes the spectacle of arena combat, the reality behind these performances involve an intricate commercial enterprise that treated human beings as valuable commodities to be bought, sold, trained, and ultimately sacrificed for public entertainment. The gladiatorial trade operated through multiple interconnected channels, ranging from legitimate schools supervised by the state to clandestine networks that circumvented official regulations. This underground economy flourished alongside the official system, creating opportunities for enormous profit while simultaneously exposing participants to extraordinary risks. Understanding this black market requires examining the economic forces, social structures, and legal frameworks that enabled such a system to exist and thrive for centuries. The origins of gladiatorial combat can be traced to Etruscan funeral rites, where armed combat served as a form of human sacrifice to honor deceased nobles. However, by the time these practices were adopted and expanded by the Romans, they had evolved into a sophisticated entertainment industry with complex economic underpinnings. The transformation from religious ritual to commercial spectacle created the conditions necessary for a thriving underground market in human fighters. The legal status of gladiators varied considerably, creating opportunities for exploitation within the gaps of Roman law. While some gladiators were slaves purchased specifically for arena combat, others were free citizens who voluntarily entered into contracts with gladiatorial schools. A third category consisted of condemned criminals sentenced to fight in the arena as a form of capital punishment. This diverse legal landscape created numerous opportunities for unscrupulous operators to manipulate the system for financial gain. The primary source of gladiators was the slave trade, which provided a steady supply of human material for the arenas. Prisoners of war, particularly those captured during Rome's numerous military campaigns, formed a significant portion of this population. These individuals possessed no legal rights and could be bought and sold at will, making them ideal subjects for gladiatorial training. The conquest of Gaul, Germania, and other territories provided thousands of potential fighters, many of whom possessed military skills that translated well to arena combat. Slave dealers operated extensive networks throughout the empire, identifying and acquiring individuals with the physical attributes and combat potential necessary for successful gladiatorial careers. These merchants maintained sophisticated evaluation systems, assessing factors such as physical strength, agility, courage, and trainability. The most promising candidates commanded premium prices, while those deemed less suitable were sold at discount rates to smaller, less prestigious schools. The transportation of gladiatorial slaves presented significant logistical challenges and opportunities for profit. Dealers organized caravans that moved fighters from capture points to training facilities, often covering thousands of miles across dangerous terrain. These journeys were expensive and risky, with mortality rates that could significantly impact profitability. Successful dealers invested heavily in security, medical care, and proper nutrition to ensure their human cargo arrived in fighting condition. Regional variations in the gladiatorial trade reflected local conditions and preferences. Eastern provinces, with their established networks of slavery and combat sports, provided experienced trainers and specialized fighters. Northern territories supplied physically imposing warriors accustomed to brutal combat conditions. African provinces contributed exotic fighters whose unfamiliar fighting styles could captivate Roman audiences seeking novelty in their entertainment. The pricing structure of the gladiatorial market reflected complex calculations of risk, potential return, and market demand. A young, untrained slave might cost the equivalent of several months' wages for a skilled craftsman, while a proven gladiator with arena experience could command prices comparable to luxury properties. These valuations fluctuated based on market conditions, seasonal demand, and the reputation of individual fighters. Investment in gladiators required substantial capital and sophisticated risk management strategies. Purchasers faced the constant possibility that their investments might die or be permanently injured in combat, resulting in total financial loss. This uncertainty led to the development of insurance-like arrangements, where multiple investors shared the costs and risks associated with individual fighters. Such partnerships allowed smaller operators to participate in the trade while distributing potential losses across multiple parties. The training process itself represented a significant component of the gladiatorial economy. Specialized instructors, many of whom were former gladiators themselves, commanded high fees for their expertise in developing fighting skills and arena techniques. These trainers possessed intimate knowledge of combat styles, weapon preferences, and psychological preparation methods that could mean the difference between victory and death in the arena. Training facilities, known as ludus, operated as businesses in their own right, generating revenue through multiple streams. In addition to training services, these establishments rented out gladiators for private events, provided security services, and sometimes engaged in breeding programs designed to produce the next generation of fighters. The most successful ludus developed brand recognition, with their graduates commanding premium prices in the gladiatorial market. The relationship between official gladiatorial schools and the black market was complex and often symbiotic. While legitimate schools operated under state supervision and maintained official records, they frequently engaged in transactions with underground dealers to acquire new fighters or dispose of those no longer suitable for arena combat. This gray area between legal and illegal operations created opportunities for corruption and exploitation that undermined official oversight efforts. Corruption within the gladiatorial system extended throughout the administrative hierarchy, from low-level guards and trainers to high-ranking officials responsible for organizing games. Bribery, embezzlement, and fraudulent accounting practices were commonplace, creating opportunities for criminal organizations to infiltrate and manipulate the official system. These corrupt practices often went undetected for years, allowing underground networks to operate with relative impunity. The financing of gladiatorial schools and individual fighters often involved complex arrangements that resembled modern organized crime operations. Wealthy patrons provided capital in exchange for shares of future earnings, while moneylenders offered loans secured against the value of gladiatorial assets. These financial relationships created webs of obligation and dependence that could be exploited by criminal elements seeking to control various aspects of the gladiatorial trade. The operational mechanisms of the gladiatorial black market revealed sophisticated organizational structures that rivaled legitimate businesses in their complexity and efficiency. Criminal networks specialized in different aspects of the trade, from acquisition and transportation to training and placement, creating a parallel economy that operated alongside official gladiatorial institutions. These organizations developed their own hierarchies, territories, and codes of conduct that govern interactions between different criminal groups. The recruitment phase of the black market gladiatorial trade involved multiple acquisition methods, each presenting distinct risks and profit potentials. Kidnapping operations targeted individuals from frontier regions and less protected communities, particularly those with desirable physical characteristics or combat experience. These criminal enterprises required extensive planning, including intelligence gathering, route mapping, and coordination with corrupt officials who could facilitate transportation and documentation. Fraudulent enslavement represented another significant source of gladiatorial recruits, particularly targeting free citizens who lacked strong social connections or legal protection. Criminal operators would manufacture debts, forge legal documents, or exploit bureaucratic confusion to justify the enslavement of individuals who should have remained free. These schemes often involve collusion with corrupt magistrates, clerks, and legal officials who could provide necessary documentation and procedural cover. The manipulation of existing legal processes provided additional opportunities for criminal acquisition of gladiatorial candidates. Court officials could be bribed to ensure harsh sentences for minor offenses directing convicted individuals toward gladiatorial service rather than other forms of punishment. Similarly, military commanders might classify prisoners of war as slaves rather than ransomable captives, redirecting them into criminal networks rather than official processing channels. Underground gladiatorial schools operated with different priorities and constraints than their legitimate counterparts, focusing on rapid profit generation rather than long-term fighter development. These facilities typically maintained minimal infrastructure, relied on harsh training methods, and accepted higher mortality rates in exchange for reduced operational costs. The quality of fighters produced by such institutions was often inferior, but their lower prices attracted buyers seeking quantity over quality. The medical care provided in illegal gladiatorial operations was typically substandard, reflecting the criminal operators' focus on short-term profits over long-term fighter health. Underground facilities rarely employed skilled physicians, instead relying on basic wound treatment and crude surgical procedures. This inadequate medical support resulted in higher infection rates, permanent disabilities, and premature deaths that reduced the overall value of gladiatorial investments. Training methodologies in the black market emphasized rapid skill acquisition and psychological conditioning designed to produce aggressive, fearless fighters in minimal time. These accelerated programs often relied on brutal methods including starvation, physical abuse, and psychological manipulation to break down individual resistance and create obedient combat machines. The effectiveness of such techniques was questionable, but they allowed criminal operators to reduce training costs and accelerate revenue generation. The distribution networks for illegal gladiators operated through sophisticated channels that connected suppliers with purchasers while minimizing exposure to law enforcement. These networks maintained detailed knowledge of market demands, seasonal variations, and regional preferences, allowing them to optimize pricing and placement strategies. Communication between network participants relied on coded messages, trusted intermediaries, and carefully scheduled meetings that reduced the risk of detection. Quality control in the black market gladiatorial trade presented significant challenges, as buyers often lacked opportunities to thoroughly evaluate fighters before purchase. Criminal dealers developed reputational systems and informal guarantees to address these concerns, offering limited warranties or exchange privileges for fighters who failed to meet basic performance standards. However, these arrangements were difficult to enforce and often led to disputes that could escalate into violence between criminal organizations. The pricing strategies employed in the illegal gladiatorial market reflected complex calculations that balanced multiple risk factors and market conditions. Underground dealers typically offered fighters at significant discounts compared to legitimate sources, compensating for quality concerns and legal risks through reduced prices. However, premium fighters with exceptional skills or unique characteristics could command prices comparable to those in the official market, particularly when demand exceeded supply. Seasonal fluctuations in the gladiatorial market created opportunities for speculative trading and inventory management strategies similar to those employed in commodity markets. Criminal operators learned to anticipate demand cycles associated with major festivals, political events, and seasonal celebrations, adjusting their acquisition and pricing strategies accordingly. Successful dealers maintained inventories of fighters in various stages of training, allowing them to respond quickly to sudden increases in demand. The transportation of illegal gladiators required elaborate security measures to prevent escapes, minimize mortality, and avoid detection by authorities. Criminal networks developed specialized expertise in moving human cargo across long distances, including knowledge of safe routes, reliable safe houses, and corrupt officials who could be bribed to overlook suspicious activities. These transportation systems often served multiple criminal enterprises, creating economies of scale that reduced operational costs. Financing mechanisms within the black market gladiatorial trade resembled modern criminal financial networks, involving money laundering, offshore investments, and complex ownership structures designed to obscure the true controllers of various operations. Wealthy investors seeking high returns but maintaining plausible deniability often provided capital through intermediaries, creating multiple layers of separation between funding sources and criminal activities. The insurance and risk management practices developed by criminal gladiatorial operators demonstrated sophisticated understanding of actuarial principles and portfolio theory. Underground dealers created informal insurance pools where multiple operators shared losses from fighter deaths, injuries, or confiscations. These arrangements helped stabilize the market and encourage continued investment despite the inherent risks of the trade. Competition between criminal gladiatorial networks occasionally erupted into violent conflicts that resembled modern organized crime wars. These disputes typically arose from territorial disagreements, contract violations, or attempts by one organization to eliminate competition. Such conflicts could disrupt entire regional markets and attract unwanted attention from law enforcement, leading criminal leaders to develop informal arbitration mechanisms and territorial agreements designed to minimize destructive competition. The relationship between criminal gladiatorial operators and corrupt officials was characterized by complex webs of mutual dependence and shared risk. Officials provided legal protection, advance warning of enforcement activities, and assistance with documentation and transportation. In exchange, they received regular payments, shares of profits, and access to gladiatorial services for private events. These corrupt relationships were carefully managed to avoid exposure while maximizing mutual benefits. The infiltration of legitimate gladiatorial institutions by criminal elements occurred through multiple pathways, including bribery of existing personnel, placement of criminal associates in key positions, and acquisition of failing legitimate businesses. This infiltration allowed criminal networks to access official documentation, legal protections, and market credibility while maintaining their illegal operations. The blending of legitimate and criminal activities made detection and prosecution extremely difficult for Roman authorities. The enforcement challenges faced by Roman authorities in combating the gladiatorial black market reflected broader limitations in ancient law enforcement capabilities and the pervasive corruption that undermined official efforts. The vast scale of the Roman Empire, combined with limited communication systems and inadequate investigative resources, created numerous opportunities for criminal networks to operate with minimal risk of detection or prosecution. Roman legal frameworks governing gladiatorial activities contained significant gaps and ambiguities that criminal operators exploited to avoid prosecution. The complex legal status of different categories of fighters, combined with jurisdictional disputes between various levels of government, created confusion that criminal lawyers skilled in manipulating legal technicalities could exploit. These legal vulnerabilities were compounded by the fact that many judges and prosecutors were themselves involved in gladiatorial investment, creating conflicts of interest that compromised enforcement efforts. The investigative capabilities of Roman law enforcement were severely limited by technological constraints and institutional weaknesses that made detecting and prosecuting gladiatorial crimes extremely difficult. Unlike modern police forces, Roman authorities lacked centralized databases, forensic science capabilities, or sophisticated surveillance methods. Investigations relied heavily on informants, witnesses, and physical evidence that criminal networks learned to eliminate or discredit. Corruption within law enforcement ranks represented perhaps the greatest obstacle to effective enforcement of gladiatorial regulations. Criminal networks systematically identified and compromised key officials through bribery, blackmail, and other forms of coercion. These corrupt relationships provided criminal operators with advance warning of raids, protection from prosecution, and assistance in eliminating competitors or troublesome witnesses. The prosecution of gladiatorial crimes was further complicated by the social status and political connections of many individuals involved in the trade. Wealthy investors, prominent politicians, and influential businessmen who participated in illegal gladiatorial activities possessed resources and connections that enabled them to avoid prosecution or secure lenient treatment. This two-tier justice system discouraged lower-level participants from cooperating with authorities and reinforced the perception that gladiatorial crimes were essentially unpunishable. Economic incentives within the Roman legal system often worked against effective enforcement of gladiatorial regulations. The confiscation and sale of illegal gladiatorial assets could generate substantial revenue for enforcement agencies, creating perverse incentives that encourage selective enforcement based on the value of potential seizures rather than the severity of criminal activities. This approach often resulted in the targeting of smaller operators while allowing larger criminal networks to continue operating by sharing profits with enforcement officials. The social acceptance of gladiatorial combat as legitimate entertainment created cultural barriers to enforcement that extended throughout Roman society. Even individuals who recognized the criminal nature of certain gladiatorial activities often viewed these crimes as necessary evils that enabled the continued provision of popular entertainment. This social tolerance provided criminal networks with broad community support that facilitated their operations and hindered law enforcement efforts. Regional variations in enforcement priorities and capabilities created opportunities for criminal networks to shift operations between jurisdictions with different levels of law enforcement activity. Criminal operators developed detailed knowledge of local enforcement patterns, corrupt officials, and legal vulnerabilities that enabled them to optimize their operational strategies. This jurisdictional arbitrage allowed successful criminal networks to maintain operations even when facing increased enforcement pressure in specific regions. The penalties imposed on convicted gladiatorial criminals were often insufficient to deter continued criminal activity or compensate for the profits generated by illegal operations. Fines could be absorbed as business expenses, while imprisonment terms were typically short and rarely prevented criminals from resuming their activities upon release. Even death sentences were inconsistently applied and could often be avoided through appeals, bribery, or political intervention. The victim advocacy systems available to individuals harmed by gladiatorial crimes were virtually non-existent, leaving most victims without recourse or compensation. Slaves and condemned criminals possessed no legal standing to pursue civil remedies, while free citizens faced enormous practical obstacles in pursuing cases against wealthy and well-connected criminal operators. This lack of victim support reduced the likelihood that crimes would be reported and prosecuted effectively. International cooperation in combating gladiatorial crimes was limited by political considerations, jurisdictional disputes, and practical communication difficulties. Criminal networks operating across provincial boundaries could exploit these coordination failures by moving operations between regions or establishing bases in areas with minimal law enforcement presence. The lack of standardized legal codes and enforcement procedures further complicated efforts to pursue criminal networks that operated across multiple jurisdictions. The long-term consequences of the gladiatorial black market extended far beyond the immediate victims of criminal activities, contributing to broader patterns of social violence, economic inequality, and institutional corruption that weakened the Roman Empire. The normalization of human trafficking and exploitation within the gladiatorial system established precedents and networks that facilitated other forms of criminal activity throughout the empire. The gladiatorial black market's influence on Roman society was particularly evident in its contribution to the militarization of civilian life and the acceptance of violence as a legitimate means of resolving disputes. The skills, networks, and attitudes developed within criminal gladiatorial operations often transferred to other areas of criminal activity, including organized extortion, political violence, and military rebellion. Economic historians have estimated that the gladiatorial black market represented a significant portion of the Roman Empire's underground economy, generating revenues that may have exceeded those of legitimate industries in certain regions and time periods. This criminal wealth was typically invested in other illegal activities, legitimate businesses used for money laundering, or luxury consumption that contributed to social inequality and resentment. The technological and organizational innovations developed by criminal gladiatorial networks often influenced legitimate business practices and government operations throughout the Roman Empire. Management techniques, financial instruments, and logistical systems pioneered by criminal operators were eventually adopted by legitimate enterprises, demonstrating the complex relationship between criminal innovation and broader economic development. The decline of the gladiatorial system in the later Roman Empire reflected multiple factors, including changing religious attitudes, economic pressures, and military demands that reduced the availability of resources for entertainment industries. However, the criminal networks established during the height of the gladiatorial era often survived by transitioning to other illegal activities, contributing to the organized crime problems that plagued the declining empire. Modern scholars studying the Roman gladiatorial black market have identified numerous parallels with contemporary organized crime activities, including human trafficking, illegal gambling, and entertainment industry corruption. These historical precedents provide valuable insights into the persistent challenges associated with regulating industries that combine legitimate entertainment with criminal exploitation, offering lessons that remain relevant for modern law enforcement and policy makers addressing similar issues in contemporary contexts.